Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers. Because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD and working on a product to help people overcome these problems because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you.
Forget frequently asked questions,
common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. My guest today is Peter Schein. He's the author of Humble Inquiry, The Gentle Art of Asking Instead of Telling. I recently got a complimentary copy of the book from him, which I'm starting to make my way through, so I appreciate that, Peter. He has 30 years of industry experience in marketing, strategy, and corporate development. He's worked for places such as Apple and Sun Microsystems, now Oracle. So welcome, Peter. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
And if I may humbly ask, why did you write this book?
Well, I will apologize for a sort of long answer. The first thing is this is a third edition of a book that my father and I wrote, the second edition, and my father solo wrote the first edition. So this notion of humble inquiry has been sort of out in the market, out in the ether for about 10 years or so. It actually originally came out of a book that my father wrote called Helping, that was all about the experience of going through some sort of tough times with healthcare and the illness of my mother. And my father, who has a long history in organization development, organizational psychology, and organizational culture, and was a professor for many years at MIT, had some time to sort of reflect on this idea of how can people, whether they be a consultant or whether they be an MD or whether they be a tech or however else you are charged with intervening in the well-being of another person, how can we be more effective at actually helping that other person? And one of the chapters in my father's book, Helping, was called Humble Inquiry. And that spawned the two previous editions and now this edition. My father passed away a couple of years ago. He was almost 95. We had a great, long, productive life, and we wrote a bunch of books together. And, well, this one is written by me. It's very much his voice and my voice. And I tried to sort of add a few different angles and modernize what we're talking about, but the general principle is the same about what humble inquiry really is. We refer to it as an art and an attitude. It's an art because humble inquiry means you are being adaptive and curious and creative in the way you ask people what's going on, rather than asking leading questions or asking confrontive questions or diagnostic questions. You're really trying to get at what's going on with the other person. It's sort of, think of it as great artists are often trying to see beyond what's actually visible. They're trying to communicate something in it with greater depth than, the spoken word explicitly or the image that people see. So humble inquiry is about asking questions in a way, open-ended questions, curious questions, genuinely trying to draw another person out in order to arrive at a greater sort of collective understanding of what's going on. And then we also
it sounds like asking without judgment, inquiry instead of interrogation.
Absolutely. And in fact, one of the things that we go through in the book is we compare humble inquiry to other kinds of inquiry. And those other kinds of inquiry being diagnostic inquiry or confrontive inquiry or even process inquiry, where you're not as much focused on the content of what you're discussing, but you're focused on, are we being effective communicating with each other for regardless of what we're talking about? So, but the attitude about humble inquiry is also that you're embracing the idea that you benefit by having a closer, more open, and more trusting relationship with that person that you're inquiring of or inquiring with. You're sort of saying, I am going to move beyond a transactional relationship with this person and try to reach a kind of a deeper substrate of openness and trust, because the next time we have something to talk about, when you're inquiring of me or I'm inquiring of you, will have established a deeper level of openness and trust with which to communicate fully. And humble inquiry, in our view, is one of those ways of deepening that relationship, giving yourselves a richer substrate with which to really share information. A lot of times a question can be answered with a yes/no answer. Well, how helpful is that? This is not a deposition. This is not an interrogation. This is what's going on. How can we help each other? And so asking open-ended questions, asking questions that draw people closer together is all what the humble inquiry attitude is all about.
So where did you first start using it? When did your dad first start using it? Like when he first told you about it, what examples did he give?
Well, let me start with a couple of the backstories just to sort of set some context. One of the things that triggered my father to write this book initially was he had moved out to California. And this story's it's in the book, but I'll tell it to you again, is that he was at the senior living place that he was living. He was in an area in the back that's with a bunch of trees, and he was noticing some mushrooms. And another senior in the facility pointed to the mushrooms and said, those are poisonous and they'll kill you. And it was a tell. The fact of the matter is that my father had a lot of experience with mushrooms. He had grown up picking mushrooms and eating mushrooms, knew what was poisonous, knew what was dangerous, knew what wasn't poisonous, knew what was good eating, what was not as good eating, and he knows mushroom. And this woman just sort of dove in with a tell that he just sort of thought, that turns me off. She didn't have any curiosity about what I knew. She just went in and maybe she felt compelled to warn me that I not, pick and eat these mushrooms. But as the way my father recounted it, as he said, it turned him cold. And so instead, the corollary would be somebody might ask with a little bit more curiosity, what are you looking at? And then Ed would respond, well, I'm curious what mushrooms these are, and test each other a little bit to see what each other knows. Be a little bit curious about what the other person knows, rather than just sort of leading with that tell of what you know. And the thing that really struck me about this is that we do live in this era of, it's expertise that's now becoming AI. Unfortunately, I think we're going to have to grapple with this issue even more as we grapple with AI. But the point being that, and particularly for me, having spent most of my career in Silicon Valley, the idea that your value is so much associated with what you know and what you can tell other people about what you know. And the problem is that those kinds of interactions often end up in dead end or log jams or impasses. And so if instead you sort of turn it around and say, I'm going to go into a conversation more curious about what you know and what you can inform me of than just going in and trying to express my value and sort of confirm my self-worth by telling you everything that I know. We're entering an era where the value of that sort of expertise, which now, of course, with these large learning models are so good at assimilating so much expertise that your value as an expert, I will argue, is going down. Whereas your value as an inquirer, as being able to sort of draw people in and get them to share information that they have that's contextual. It may not be exactly the kind of fact-based information that you might draw out of an AI, but there may be some context that is far more valuable in any given moment and trying to make any different given decision. So it is all about sort of that getting to the point where you're willing to embrace that your vulnerability is what you don't know. And to some extent, generative AI is going to help you, but your relationships with other human beings and getting them to be more open with you and you to be more open with them, that's where we have to go as leaders, in order to be sure that we can innovate, to be sure that we can be creative, to be sure that we can be adaptive as we face, new challenges and opportunities down the road, which starts tomorrow.
Okay. So what's I don't know, how would people react to your dad when he would use his humble inquiry type way? Having grown up with that, what did you see?
Well, first of all, I guess I should note that the term humble inquiry that came out of that book I mentioned, Helping, that really resonated with our publisher. And so it was their encouragement to say, wow, that term humble inquiry really, hits a note. It really kind of rings a bell for people. But what is interesting about your question is that if I'm hearing you right, this was the dinner table for me. This is sort of a set of ideas that I grew up with. And I guess that's right because, my father was sort of, grew up in the sort of the dawn of organization development. His mentor at MIT was a gentleman named Douglas McGregor, who wrote a very important early book called The Human Side of Enterprise. So my father was always kind of on that human side of enterprise, on that there's more to leadership by managing what's going on with the group than managing what's going on with the P&L. Or with suppliers or competitors. How you deal with really complicated interpersonal dynamic issues in organizations is really what distinguishes great leaders from good tacticians. And so I guess back to your question, I guess I did sort of grow up with that sort of inquiry of how are we going to contextualize what we're trying to figure out? What more is going on? It touches on the sort of mindfulness movement that, sort of early 21st century, how do we become sort of more present in really grappling with what's going on in the moment, rather than getting too caught up with our assumptions about what's going on, and then finding ourselves asking questions that are too deeply informed or too kind of rigidly constrained by our assumptions about what's going on, because often those assumptions are completely wrong. I do think that sort of that philosophical base and that inquisitive nature of a social scientist who learned how to make his work relevant to the business world. I guess as you're pointing out, I did learn a bunch of those lessons early on. And I suppose it informed my leadership style in Silicon Valley as well.
So what's any examples jump out in your mind? Conversations that could have gone one way, but you were able to steer them in a better direction?
Yeah. There's an example that I give in one of our books about when and you know how we often learn more from our mistakes than our successes. This was a case where I was a leader of a team, and I had a peer who was leading a team as well. So these were two teams that were joined at the hip on a shared project, but we were bicameral. We had two leaders, and we had come to a log jam and a tough decision that we had to make. And having sort of grown up with Silicon Valley decisiveness, I believed that I needed to demonstrate my leadership by saying, okay, here's what we're going to do. It was crisp, it was definitive, and rather than sort of testing the room, I could have tested the room and tried to draw out other people by asking questions in open ways, rather than, falling into that. I'm going to be decisive, I'm going to be definitive, and people are going to respond to that intent, that leadership. And I quickly heard afterwards from my co-leader that was, she was outraged. It's like, what are you doing? There is no other decision to make. And
What was she outraged about?
that I had gone in with this sort of definitive, declarative statement. Well, here's what we're going to do. And again, I was sort of young but old enough to be in a leadership position, and believing that I needed to be declarative. I needed to be, I needed to demonstrate my leadership by making a decision. Decisiveness is everything. And what I realized was that no, consensus at that point was going to be more important than whatever I had decided. And the way to build that consensus was going to be through testing, through asking open-ended questions, from finding out from people if that kind of approach would sit well. Because I would have found out that the approach that I was suggesting would not have sat well with other people. And had I, sort of not responded to her feedback later, had I just said, well, that's what we're going to do, get over it, she would have undermined me. And the last thing that you want is to feel like you're, leading definitively, to then quickly realize that at the first chance they're going to get, other people that you work with are going to try to undermine your decision. So making better decisions, making better statements with other people, or drawing out better statements from other people helps you.
What should you have said in that case? Here's what I'd like to do, but I'd like your input. Like, what should happen?
I think that's right. Or if I propose we do this, how would you respond to that? Or just simply, what's going on here? How are we going to improve this situation? How are we going to get through this logjam? That's an example of where, if the content of the decision is bogging people down, maybe you're better off to say, how are we doing here? Let people air out their feeling like, one person is feeling like you're being too, declarative and descriptive, or prescriptive. Other people might see like, we're dithering here, we need to make a decision. But you will make a better decision if you air out some of those issues. And that's what we would say, that's humble inquiry, but it's also process-oriented inquiry. You're more interested at that moment in time with, how is the group doing? How are you functioning well as a group? Because you've established, your ground rules are that you're going to make decisions based on consensus. Because if you don't have some level of consensus, you're going to just have people, with subterfuge and undermining. And so it's so easy for us to fall into the tell, right? I'm feeling like we're at an impasse, so I'm going to establish my leadership chops and I'm going to tell people what we're going to do. Yes, that can work, but the odds of it creating resistance within the group are also very high. So before you do that, you better know what the points of resistance are. And the way you find out what other people are feeling, how they might resist what you're proposing, is by drawing people out, asking them how they're feeling. And not in diagnostic questions. Diagnostic questions would be, if I did this, what would you do? No, that may be helpful information. But it would be you'd be more effective in drawing people out by saying, how do you feel about this? What do you see going on? Ways of asking people that you're not confronting them, you're not directing them, you're not sort of leading the witness. You just want to know where they're at. And so that's what the humble inquiry attitude is all about. We have this acronym that we describe in the book called sharing the mic. And mic is MIC is an acronym, and the M stands for motivation. You need to convince people that you care about their opinion. You're curious about their opinion, and you're going to respond to them by listening deeply to what they say. The I in sharing the mic is intervention. You realize that you are intervening in a decision flow. You are stopping by asking questions. You are stopping the flow by interjecting in a way that may not seem natural for people. But, people will recognize that if we're at a logjam, if we're at an impasse, we have to sort of step outside of ourselves. Now, again, to some people, this may not sound like a popular way to do this. No, we need to be decisive. We just need to make a decision and move on. But just embrace the fact that you may decide to do that, but you are going to create resistance without letting people air out some of that resistance as you go through the process. So intervention, you are intervening in the process. And then the last part of it is contribution, to recognize that you are going to ask people how they're feeling, what they value, what concerns them. But as part of that process, you also have to share how you're feeling, that it has to be a two-way street. You can't just be the clinician. You have to be a partner. And so part of that is, sort of contributing your feelings, or you may have some expertise that will help people, but recognize that it's collectively, it's sharing that expertise that's going to build a sort of deeper base of information with which the group can make a better decision.
Okay. Are there any templates or frameworks on how to do this for people that are just starting to try it?
Yeah. I mean, I'll give you a little bit of sort of the rundown of some of the things that are in the book. We do go through in a chapter, we do describe those different kinds of inquiry. And then an opportunity at the end to go through these mini case studies and sort out, how would I respond? What's the right way for me to react in this situation? And the thing that we like about this is that the idea of humble inquiry is not always that natural. Again, I've described how we are sort of brought up to tell people what we know. And so oftentimes, even in these simple case studies, we feel like, oh, okay, well, I'm being asked for advice, so I should offer advice. Well, often offering advice is the last thing that you should do, because you really need to know a lot about what's going on with somebody who's posing a problem to you before you should really offer advice. Advice is a very, very tricky issue. In fact, we have the author of a very important book called The Advice Trap, Michael Bungay Stanier, wrote the foreword to this book because he's been influenced by Ed in this book over the years. And I think he would agree with us that advice is a very, very tricky thing. And you need to really, really know what's going on by asking humble inquiry questions before you should necessarily offer what you think the answer is. Humble inquiry is about getting people to, with your help and with your sharing, getting people to get to answers on their own, so they self-advise.
Well, you mean like Socratic questioning, or what do you mean?
And I'm not sure I know exactly what you mean by Socratic questioning, but as I've described, asking open-ended questions, asking questions that will get them to tell you more about just what the presenting issue is. Because it's very easy for people to say, geez, I'm really concerned about this. But if I ask a question in a way that's very self and constrained and that's simple and constrained, then maybe somebody they won't feel overwhelmed by the question, and they'll give me a simple answer that I can respond to.
So what if you're speaking to someone that's a little bit, they're suspicious, or I don't know, they feel like people have been jumping down their throat. How do you advise someone like that?
So I'm not sure exactly what this situation you're describing, but let me take it in two ways. There's one situation where somebody is feeling like they're being badgered. You're asking so many questions without offering any help, and that's sort of part of the art of this, that it's very easy to fall into, again, that you build a hypothesis of what's going on and how you can help. That's sort of a natural thing that we do. And then you start asking diagnostic questions, and the person feels like, badgered by all of these details, and to the point where they don't feel like you're helping them. And so, it's that sort of that interrogation where you're asking questions that really you're sort of betraying the fact that you're trying to tell them what you know. Is that what you're describing? Is that the situation you're describing? So it's sort of recognizing that subtle difference between questions that feel like they're your questions, building on your hypothesis and your agenda, rather than questions that help them let you better understand what's really going on or what's really bothering them. It's very common for people, again, to draw a box around that question, so that they're not betraying their vulnerability. They're not betraying their underlying concern. They're asking a safe question. Then hopefully they'll get a safe answer that they can build on. But oftentimes that's just not helping them. And, the sort of the classic example there is somebody poses a very specific question and you give a very specific response. And the person says, yeah, I tried that yesterday. It didn't help. It didn't work. Well, that's because you were asking diagnostic questions based on what was in your head, rather than finding out what's really concerning them. So that's what this idea of let's look deeply at these different kinds of inquiry and try to sort out when humble inquiry is going to be the best approach to drawing that other person out to finding out what's really going on.
You learn someone is suspicious and they don't like to be asked questions, or you ask them questions, they seem to not want to answer them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, at a certain point, they're building a wall around a relationship. They're kind of telling you, I don't want to have a open and trusting relationship with you. I'm suspicious of you. I don't necessarily trust you. And so maybe there is a transactional information exchange that's of value to both of you, or maybe not. Maybe all of the inquiry in the world isn't gonna sort of bust through that wall. One of the things that we do describe in this book is a 4-level model of relationships that we think is very helpful for people to keep in mind. And those 4 levels are from what we call a -1 relationship, a -1 relationship, which is exploitative and based around sort of domination, right? There's a hierarchy, and there's a pecking order, there's seniority, and the senior people have the entitlement to dominate the more junior people. So that's a -1 relationship as we describe it. There's a level 1 relationship. And by the way, we have level -1 and level 1 because there's no level 0, because we're talking about a relationship. And if it's 0, there's no relationship. We are talking about, defined relationships between people in this model. And so level 1 relationship is a transactional relationship where you are sort of recognizing that you agree to share information with each other, but it's bounded. You're not necessarily saying this is an open exchange or an open API, if you will. You're saying this is a bounded information exchange. I'm going to tell you what I've agreed to tell you. You're going to tell me what I've agreed to tell you. We might value transparency, but we're not necessarily going to value openness. And so in a way, I think that's what you were describing. Somebody's a little bit suspicious. They want to maintain professional distance. They want to maintain that level 1 transactional relationship. That is well and good, and you will encounter lots of people like that in professional and personal lives. Our argument, though, is that generally better decisions and more creativity and more innovation come out of a level 2 relationship that we define as personal, where you recognize I'm a whole person. I've got a personal life. I've got a work life. That other person is a whole person with a personal life and a work life. We are going to draw closer. We're not going to cross the line. We're not going to cross the net. We recognize each other's, personal space, but we are going to be more open with each other about what's really going on. Because the next time we're facing an opportunity or challenge, that openness is going to benefit us. We're going to be more effective at communicating because we established a level of that substrate of openness and trust that makes it easier for us to share information. And then the top level is level 3, which is some level of intimacy. And generally, intimacy and sort of romantic intimacy isn't appropriate at work. But there are many cases where people spend so much time together on a project or in a particular part of an organization that they can finish each other's sentences. They've just developed a deep level of rapport that's a little bit more than just a personal relationship. It is it's truly a sort of sympathetic relationship. And so we describe that as level 3 but as many people we've talked to about this have said, their goal is to establish a level of professional intimacy that goes a little bit beyond level 2, but they recognize that too much intimacy at work is inappropriate, and so they draw a line. So being conscious of those levels of relationship and starting to be able to kind of, in fact, we have a tool in the book for how to build a relationship map of the people that you work with so that you can be quite intentional about where you need to deepen the relationship, where you need to move from level 1 to level 2. Or if not, maybe you're quite intentional about the fact that I'm not going to try to build a level 2 relationship with that person because, it's not fertile ground. They're suspicious of me. They want to maintain that professional distance. I am not going to try to push that rock up the hill. But at least now I'm accepting it and I can work within that rather than being confounded that it bothers me that I can't be intentional with people that I feel like I need to get stuff done with. And so the idea of relationship mapping is that you visualize this, that you're have an ability to sort of work through challenges and opportunities with that mental map, with that relationship map in your head. Other things that are in the book, we go into a little bit of the history of some of the social psychology of people in groups. So we talk about some of the different models about how our brain does things that aren't necessarily helpful to us sometimes in these kind of situations. Confirmation bias, things like that. Those are important constructs that are part of this whole set of ideas and practices. And then, as I mentioned, there are ways to practice this stuff that we describe at the end of the book. And throughout the book, there are examples of things that you can practice and things that you can try.
Do you recommend people like this idea? You recommend people try this at work or at home first or with family? Like, where's a safer environment to try it?
The examples, the little mini case studies at the back of the book, in the appendix, are a combination of work and personal examples. I think it's great to do both. It may feel safer to try this at home, with loved ones, but we also have had a lot of success with people in project teams or smaller work groups saying, we are going to try this. We're going to model this. We're going to go through the exercises. We are going to practice this as a group. It's a safe space. We're not doing anything that's radically different here, but we are going to practice it as a small group so that we can broaden the skill set with other people And in some cases, we've had clients that have sort of established an ambassador program where they will take some of these ideas, and a subset group, a smaller group, will really learn them deeply, and then we'll try to sort of roll them out with their respective work teams, or have a group that will go around literally training other affiliated groups or smaller work teams in the practice of humble inquiry. And because it's something that has to be learned. It's not automatic.
Right. I mean, I don't know, how has it changed your relationships with people as you've implemented it?
Well, I mean, I think it's my experience generally is that people respond well to openness and to communicating a certain amount of vulnerability that gives people a sense that you're real, you're authentic, you're not bullshitting. And so, again, there are some people in your networks and in your sort of spheres of interaction who might think it's bunk and try to take advantage of you. But I just, I believe deep down that people respond well when you sort of bring a little bit of humility and you bring some curiosity to those relationships.
And so, I guess it's like a learner, or is it a judger? Respond well to it. Yeah, it sounds like a learner versus like a judger mindset.
Absolutely. Very, very, very similar concept. I don't think leaders ever fail or are criticized or are punished for curiosity. And humble inquiry is a way of expressing curiosity. Yeah.
Okay. Well, very good. So the third edition is now out on Amazon and everywhere else?
It's now out, available as a paperback and as a Kindle or as an audiobook, all of those ways. In fact, I will say that in the subsequent editions of this book, even though there are a bunch of exercises, we have tried to make it a little bit less graphical, knowing that a lot of people like to listen to books like this. So we don't have a bunch of descriptions of graphics. We got rid of the graphics and wrote it so that it could be readable and listenable. So hopefully then people will find benefit in that.
Sure, very good. But yeah, I encourage people to think of the book to learn this skill to help their relationships. It sounds like both are working at home.
Yes, absolutely. And the other thing that I will say is that it takes training. It takes practice. My wife will be the first person to say, I am not being a humble inquirer. And it's like, yeah, you're right. It's sort of easy to believe in something and to describe it. Sometimes it's not as easy to do as you think it's going to be. We have I mentioned confirmation bias. We have our brains are very much wired to sort of believe what they believe and know what they know, and to accept you're vulnerable to what you don't know, and try to embrace that and build on it by asking questions that you really don't know the answer to. It's powerful and it's disarming. I think generally people respond very well to that. So I encourage people to try it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, very good. Well, Peter, thank you so much for writing it and carrying on your dad's legacy and for continuing. So, and thanks for being on the podcast.
And thank you very much. And I appreciate your honoring my father's legacy. It was a great honor to write with him, and it's a great honor for me to sort of continue the work. So, and I very much appreciate your interest and hope it lands well with your listeners.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.